Before I begin with my philosophical musings, let me bombard you here with a series of quotes that I find inspirational. The first one is by Erwin Schrödinger. Quote, "What is this I? You will, on close introspection, find that what you really mean by I is the ground stuff upon which all experiences and memories are collected." Unquote. The next one is by the mystic Thomas Merton. Quote, "If I penetrate to the depths of my own existence, to the indefinable am that is myself in its deepest roots, then through this deep center I pass into the infinite I am, which is the very name of the Almighty." Unquote. The third quote is by the 12th century Spanish Sufi Ibn al-Arabi. Quote, "God sleeps in the rock, dreams in the plant, stirs in the animal, and awakens in man." Unquote. My friend Stephen Wallard was wondering if Rumi said this when he spoke to Ilana on the Hermetic Idealism channel, so I decided to look it up, and it was Al-Arabi. The next quote is by the one and only Albert Einstein. Quote, "The intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift." Unquote. In the 18th century, the transcendental idealist Immanuel Kant said, quote, "Space and time are the framework within which the mind is constrained to construct its experience of reality." Unquote. 200 years earlier, Giordano Bruno observed that, and I quote, "Knowledge and love are thus revealed as the two cosmic forces which are apparently separate in nature, but which spring from the same potency and source." Unquote. The following quote is by Francis de Sales, which I found in Ed Halliwell's Into the Heart of Mindfulness and Joseph Goldstein's The Experience of Insight and Natural Unfolding. Quote, "If the heart wanders or is distracted, bring it back to the point quite gently. And even if you do nothing during the whole of your hour, but bring your heart back 1,000 times, though it went away every time you brought it back, your hour would be very well employed." Unquote. The 8th quote is an excerpt from the book Tranta Illuminated by Christopher Wallis. Quote, "All that exists throughout all time and beyond is one infinite consciousness, free and blissful, which projects within the field of its awareness a vast multiplicity of apparently differentiated subjects and objects, where each object is an actualization of a timeless potentiality inherent in the light of consciousness, and each subject is also that, plus is a contracted locus of self-awareness. This creation is a play insofar as it has no reason for being other than itself, and it is the result of the natural impulse within consciousness to express the totality of its self-knowledge in action, an impulse arising from love. The unbounded light of consciousness contracts into finite embodied loci of awareness out of its own free will." Unquote. Now we can start here by making some plausible idealistic scenarios germane to the last quote or excerpt. From the perspective of the mind at large, or the one consciousness, all potentials are explored, including the constructs which are finitely defined. I suspect this much. Source consciousness has free will within its infinite potential and explores all possible scenarios simultaneously. Through us, it can explore worlds from a finite perspective. It witnesses human lives through us, including the experience of a lesser will that is constrained by rules and natural laws. Hence the experience that we are not fully in control and where the notion of determinism is reinforced. There are only so many choices available to us as restricted loci of consciousness, and the decisions we make are determined by urges we can't help but have as human beings. The rules of this universe precede our birth, which means that we decided upon those rules when we were greater than ourselves as humans. Now we suffer the consequences of those timeless choices. In a sense, we punish ourselves with this life that we often think is tough. I have noticed that in quite a few NDEs, the would-be revenants are greeted by an all-loving light with a sense of humour. This light tends to define itself as one and many, and once near-death experiences merge with it, there is a sense of expansion and omniscience. Sometimes they have a laugh with other beings of light, and if they are not having a party in the luminiferous ether, they go off gallivanting to explore other worlds, radically different from the one we know. And none of them want to leave the freedom, the love, and the bliss they experience in the light. On departure, the light tells the visitors they take life on earth too seriously, and it should be about having fun. Then they are sent back. Near-death experiences often feel like they have gone to their real home when they go to the light, like prodigal children returning home. You might think that these experiences support literalist creeds within organized religion, but such mystical experiences precede religion and the concept of gods and deities that humans have come up with. The source of such experiences certainly precedes all representations and symbols that our species has devised in order to linguistically apprehend certain archetypes. However we interpret such experiences, they are a product of nature, and we should always remember this. Stephen Wallard's journey is similar to mine about all this. Like him, I have a religious background. I started out as a child of Catholicism, but maturity led me to conclude that the tenets of my former faith are ludicrously absurd, the literalists of Scripture losing, and I saw the atheists winning with science and reason. Where death is concerned, I made my peace with oblivion. Then physicalism failed, and turned out to be nothing but another doctrine with its roots in political ulterior motives to defeat the influence of their rivals, the Church. Now, it seems, consciousness is God and we are it. Idealism is parsimonious and more plausible as it solves the riddle of the mind-body problem. Sometimes I think that if the Church hadn't been so horrible, heretics wouldn't have come up with ways to ridicule some of the truths embedded in Scripture, some of which imparts wisdom, and perhaps today people would be more open to the idea that consciousness is fundamental. Why do people still have that tendency to think that it's woo to say consciousness is fundamental? Because it makes us eternal and affirms an afterlife. And this, for some reason, is thought of as a thing of religion. But organized religion, in a bid to control the masses, hijacked mystical experiences as supposed proof that its gospels are true. But transcendent and transpersonal experiences precede religion because they are a thing of nature, and this one is mental. It feels like both sides, the theistic dualists and the atheistic materialists, have been lying to us about metaphysics. It seems that everything was politicized before, and everything is still politicized now. Both sides have been hypocritical and deceptive in their hidden agendas. Nature is far more interesting than anybody could have ever imagined. The truth about manifest reality goes beyond human minds, and as complex as it appears to be, it is a unified field. Monism is true, as evidence tells us, and this universe is most likely a little story amidst myriad stories, as it were, that the one consciousness tells itself. Just like the narratives and daydreams our personal minds come up with, as above, so below. I've been exploring near-death experiences lately, and many reports involve meeting an all-loving light, which describes itself as I and we, where people are overwhelmed by peace and love. Many of these patients remember past lives and they are that they agreed to. They remember these lives that they agreed to, and they agreed to their current life, and even planned it prior to being born. They are also able to experience from other people's perspectives, and they learn about how their actions affected others on an emotional level. The message appears to be the same, that we are all one consciousness experiencing different perspectives, creating the illusion of separateness in this world. Upon flatlining and having no measurable activity in their brains, their consciousness expands as the brain no longer spatiotemporally constricts it, and they can experience other realms, perceive more colours, acquire new insights, and even meet with deceased loved ones. They become more, not less, on the verge of death. The reason why I have been researching NDE reports recently is to get an idea of what's to come. There is no question in my mind that the brain does not generate consciousness. It is merely a partial image of a human mentation on Earth. You see, I've been a materialist for many years up until recently. During my years of being a materialist, I was bothered by the hard problem of consciousness. Consciousness didn't fit anywhere and seemed magical. Eventually, I noticed things happening in the scientific community regarding the phenomenon, and it led me to conclude that it is fundamental. Consciousness underpins all reality. As I've recounted in previous videos, my paradigm shift away from physicalism started with the Nobel Prize winners of 2022. In the physics sphere, the culmination of experiments that violated Bell's inequalities, disproving local realism. These scientists abandoned physicalism in favour of metaphysical idealism. Then, observations at the Large Hadron Collider began to reveal geometries beyond the Planck scale, showing that space-time is only a feature, not a fundamental. I've been on a journey, as you can see. Federico Fagin, the inventor of the microprocessor, and Giacomo Doriano, the father of quantum metrology, two geniuses, both have a theory of consciousness that places it at the roots of reality. They are both idealists, not physicalists. They affirm that we don't really die because we are not our bodies. We are, primarily, the eternal witness, as consciousness is the ground of existence. So there is no question that nature permits an afterlife. I arrived at the conclusion that experience is continuous beyond physical death, but I questioned what awaits us after this life. The only way to get a glimpse is to heed NDE reports. That's when I began to notice that people who come back from the other side and tell the tale share commonalities. Their experiences can differ amongst themselves, but they appear to exhibit universal themes. They usually involve out-of-body sensations, feelings of peace, encountering a warm, loving light, apprehending a wider reality, a sense of unity with other sentient beings, a sense of near omniscience, or, in the least, an epiphany or revelation, etc. So those reports, albeit anecdotal, strongly suggest that profound mystical experiences take place when someone dies. They are certainly transpersonal and mind-expanding. I have also looked at the neuroscience of our brains, and I can tell you this much. Evidence agrees more with filtration theory than anything else. It is true that brain activity appears to correlate with conscious experiences, but even this correlation isn't what was predicted by materialist models. For instance, They predicted that brain activity would accompany the duration of specific conscious experiences, but what was observed was that activity only manifested at the initial stages, as if only heralding the conscious experience that would continue to unfold beyond the neural correlates. In other words, neurons ceased to fire while mentation persisted. The lesson here is that correlation isn't necessarily causation, as I pointed out in previous videos, and to conflate the two is to commit a well-known fallacy in the philosophy of science. Cum hoc ergo propter hoc, at the same time, therefore because of it. The analogy I tend to use to clarify this is the following. The voice on the radio correlates with electromagnetic oscillations in the radio circuitry, but the radio does not in any way synthesize the voice. The radio merely picks up a signal. The same goes for the brain. We currently identify as human beings, but that's not all that we are. In my view, Hindu philosophy and Advaita Vedanta in particular appear to convey what science is finding out in modern times about the nature of reality. Monistic idealism is true. Concepts like Brahman and Atman are found in the Vedas and Upanishads. Atman is the soul, a drop in the infinite ocean that is Brahman. Both the drops and the ocean are one and the same, one and many. It is all water in the end. It is all mind. Just like the first Hermetic principle in the Kabbalion, mentalism. So this universe is nothing but a dream shared by multiple observers. We are currently personal minds experiencing the contents of a larger mind, a larger reality. Our brains, including our bodies, are analogous to small whirlpools in a Castropian ocean, let's say, filtering in some ripples of vibratory information, but missing out on most of what's out there. We might think that the whirlpool is separate from the ocean, but it's not. Again, it is all water, or in Kastrup's more refined analogy towards something like M-theory, reality is analogous to a mercurial sea of experiences. Water, or the highly reflective quicksilver, represents consciousness. So, when the whirlpool ceases to be, we become unbounded, we expand, and presumably all is revealed. I am aware that my view implies continued experience beyond physical death, but so what? I am not here to provide consolation because death is nigh, although I understand that the truth might be consoling to some. I am just expressing what my research has led me to conclude. Nature allows for an afterlife. You cannot escape what you are, consciousness. Whether you like it or not, you are the eternal witness. Your brain is like an oculus, enabling you to efficiently interact with this VR, as it were. And our science is merely based on the pixels of this game, and the patterns we detect allow us to glimpse its rules or laws of nature. But if your oculus or brain is damaged, of course it will affect your perception of the world. Of course it will affect information input into your temporary avatar. Of course it will change the way you feel about this world and what you think of it. If the oculus is completely destroyed, you realize your avatar was just made of pixels. You remember that the game was just an illusion that you took seriously, and you can then remove that Hoffmanian headset and realize that there is a wider reality. Your experience continues. I hope everybody can see where the analogies take us. Materialists and idealists should agree on the same science, the science of the game where waves, particles, molecules, cells, animals, plants and brains are observed, but they are only expressions of what the underlying reality is doing. as I've said before, and to echo Kastrup because it bears repeating, the brain is a partial representation of a complex mental process in the medium of mind. It isn't the full story of what someone is any more than the image of flames provides you with the full story of what combustion, with all its chemical interactions, entails. Statistics in science can be useful, but it can also be its Achilles heel. This isn't an attack on science, but rather a justified criticism of human bias and prejudice against those brave enough to go against the dogmatic elite in academia as a result of thinking outside the box. I was listening to Bernardo Kastrup on Third Eye Drops about Carl Jung's synchronicity and statistics the other day, and he made an important observation. Despite being a useful tool in science as an effort to determine whether or not a discovery is a real phenomenon or the result of pure chance, statistics are, in fact, surprisingly ambiguous. They can always create a situation in which you can interpret things according to your paradigm. One can rely on statistics to defend any idea as an explanation of what is observed. One can always say the following about something unusual. It's unlikely that it is the product of chance, but it could still be random. And randomness is only a concept we use for when we don't know enough about a sequence of events. It is when we can't detect any patterns with our human minds, or when we don't see meaningful connections. But despite the fact that we can't discern a pattern, as we define randomness as having any statistical distribution, it doesn't mean that there isn't one. The contradiction we create when defining randomness is that we say it's both devoid of patterns and at the same time it can have any pattern. Sometimes we even say, and I am guilty of having said this, I've said it as a bookie in the past, that a human being's idea of randomness is often contradicted by random number generators because the machine's pattern-destroying algorithm sometimes ineluctably creates repetitive sequences from which human minds are always tempted to derive meaning. After all, we are pattern-seeking animals. This forces us to speak about reality in terms of probabilities and the likelihood that some hypotheses are true or false. As Kastrup points out, if a scientific experiment appears to favour analytic idealism over materialism and includes synchronicity, someone who is averse to the idea that the universe is ultimately mental in nature could define randomness as having any statistical distribution, that the apparent patterns are meaningless, completely dismissing statistical evidence for meaningful layers of reality, even if correlations span decades. Naysayers of idealism and synchronicity could be dismissive of such propositions by saying that the data could still be the result of chance because what's random can take any appearance, including pattern repetition, which they say is devoid of any meaningful connections, over a long period of time as the work is peer-reviewed. This isn't a criticism of science itself, but rather human biases. In one of my previous videos I described how an infinite universe where matter can only be arranged in a finite number of ways can produce astronomical coincidences such as Earth analogues or even entire replicas of the Milky Way in both space and time, which would blow our human minds. And yet, a mere near enough pattern distribution in a very limited time span and limited space was enough to conclude the existence of one of the missing pieces in the standard model of physics, the Higgs boson. How can we then be so dismissive of the synchronicities that Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli posited? It's quite evident that even in the field of science, one can still afford to arbitrarily favour some ideas over others. The fact of the matter is that the discovery of Earth analogues would mean different things to different people, as evidence of another layer of reality manifesting within the psyche. If we discovered that our planet was entirely unique in our universe, despite the overwhelming mathematical probabilities telling us that replicas should be inevitable, some of us would find that mighty strange, while others would dismiss it as just a highly improbable coincidence, with emphasis that improbability isn't impossibility. Even when something is deemed to be meaningless by someone, it is still what that something means to that person. The entire world, with all the good and the bad, its fortunes and calamities and its myriad phenomena, can mean radically different things to different people. Just recently, someone asked, how can a perfectly good God permit chaos and evil in the world? This is a perfectly reasonable question to ask, as it evokes the old problem of evil. No theodicy in the world can vindicate a good God in the face of evil. But perhaps God isn't what people think it is. We tend to anthropomorphize God when the message is that he is everywhere and cannot be reduced to a finite thing. If consciousness is God, then we are God in this monistic idealism. It is all the mind of God, and this universe is nothing but an idea or complex thought in his infinite mind. God can be one and many. If he is omniscient, he knows all possible dichotomies in the field of awareness, including good and evil. How else is God, the ultimate reality, pure consciousness, supposed to know evil if this one doesn't manifest in his mind? His mind is our reality. Knowing one end of a spectrum immediately evokes the other. The concept of polar opposites emerges. Things can be defined by what they are not. Dark brings to mind the light, and vice versa. God, as a loving, compassionate witness, allows it all to be, playing with narratives and concepts, creating illusory realities when it is just him all along. It is all mind. Yes, from a human perspective, this world can certainly be an awful playground, partially derived from a more wholesome divine reality. We experience scarcity in this world by choice, but we just don't remember it. If we are to take some NDE reports seriously, this is the case. Now, from our limited human perspective, we get fed up, revolted with this zoo. We don't want it, and we make efforts to change it or adapt ourselves to it. But this playground gives us the opportunity to exercise good behaviour, to help others, to express comfort, care and love. The project of spreading fun and love in a dark, chaotic world. To also be creative and to fix things, to create order out of chaos. Perhaps the spiritual teacher Ideation, whose name means primordial peace, by the way, is right when he says that in the end, spirituality is about waking up from the dream of separateness to the truth of unity. This could turn out to be difficult if reincarnation or rebirth is a thing. How many lives have we lived? As soon as I became aware of knowing how to speak, I apparently recalled my earliest memory. When asked by an adult, my reply was, I think I remember seeing Mum and Dad for the first time as a baby, but their faces weren't clear. That night I had a dream which felt like a memory of an event that ostensibly preceded what I thought was the first experience. It was a strange kind of anamnesis. In that dream, I was a cowboy drinking in a saloon, standing by a bar. I heard a whistle that gradually turned into a mocking and ominous tune. There was a feeling of dread, and all concerned eyes were on me. I turned around to see a mustachioed cowboy before a loud bang. Confusion and imbalance ensued, and I woke up. Upon awakening, I seemed to recall what I believed to be the original events more clearly, but I can't be sure whether or not I was trying to make sense of the whole thing on a more subconscious level. I remembered that the confusion and imbalance after having been shot led to an unknown darkness followed by an unknown brightness. Confusion leading to curiosity, and then the perception of loving fuzzy faces, which I believe to be my first experience of my parents. Of course, I cannot be sure that I remembered the last moments of a past life, knowing how treacherous memory can be. After all, false memory syndrome is a thing. In trying to understand consciousness by examining my subjective experience, I quickly realized how much I don't understand how memory works. One can experience the abstractionist side of the mind with a great, albeit bogus, sense of understanding, as in ordinary dreams, and paradoxically think of the very same experience as nonsensical in the waking state. From the perspective of waking life, the dream is an episode of temporary psychosis. I bring this up because about 10 years ago, a shocking insight came to me while I was thinking about ways to improve memory. I imagined a scenario where I was being mnemonically tested. In my imagination, I was in a room and a person would come in wearing something that would have to be remembered later. A second person would enter the room, and again I would have to remember the details of what they were wearing. In addition, their names and the order in which they appeared would have to be memorized too. After pondering about a possible way to remember all of it, I arrived at the conclusion that making the process fun would be key. The solution I came up with was to convert memory of what was experienced into an interesting or catchy story where the people's names would be followed by nicknames matching their attire. For example, Thomas Bluebow brings up a blue bow or tie. Miss Amy Wineblouse brings up a red blouse. Peter Wrangler brings up black jeans in my mind, and so forth. The story would develop with the flow of characters idiosyncratically coming and going. This resolute concept was devised in my head in a few seconds, but what hadn't been apparent at first was that its details had not been mentally conceived in the eloquent version that I have just expressed. Insofar as mental processing went, I had not consciously thought of any specific names of people nor any type of clothing whatsoever. Strangely, what accompanied my eloquent conception, as coherent as my recollection can make it, was this: trick-a-trendy parachuter. It makes no sense. How odd is that? Tricker is not even a name, but who knows what kind of schema it linguistically represents in my mind, and what it may beget. Trendy is not a piece of clothing, although it may in this case be akin to the adjective largely associated with fashion in its holistic power. The process of generating such thought was so natural to the point of making perfect sense in my daydreaming mode, as opposed to the mystification that the mnemonic perspective later conveyed. At the time of conception, a moment totally free from its revisory wake, I knew its translation to be exactly what I have stated here as an example of the solution to improve memory. How could this be? The revisory wake revealed the vaguely linguistic conception less meaningful, as though lost in translation. Did I just experience Gödel's incompleteness regarding my brain and how my mind works? Was it something akin to being unable to prove the reliability of human logic without running into circular reasoning? Gradually, however, the detective in me began to come up with clues or ideas for why tricker, why trendy, para and shooter. But it was only speculative. Tricker could convey the idea of trick, and tricks can provide solutions. Trendy from trend can relate to clothing, or it could mean exactly that, a trend, as in get used to applying this trick or method in order to improve memory. Parachuter has the possible translation of parachuting, out of the trouble of forgetting. I started to get the impression that the strange thoughts tricker, trendy, parachuter were archetypal in that instance and conveyed the whole idea that I had in mind. Perhaps it was a childlike language as the first attempt to map the holistic mentation, akin to the gobbledygook used by dream characters in Alice's Wonderland. It seems like in that moment, when it mattered, a lot of meaning was packed in a few syllables, and then it was lost, as though no longer relevant as time had passed, making it almost impossible to forensically retrace those steps. These archetypal thoughts seemed to belong to a highly entropic type of processing which diminished consciousness, or a type of consciousness that is loose or too expansive for a reductionist approach, where abstract ideas manifest and can mean a wide array of things, but eventually they become more orderly, anthropically narrowed by some effort and time, to the detriment of the speed that comes with instinct, which always seems to be so certain and all-knowing. As that infinite potential is anthropically narrowed, it is reduced in the simplicity of the waking state, a kind of decoherence on the classical level of reality. Physicalists may intuit that consciousness is only a process composed of many processes in the brain which convey information, but they don't explain how a process involving unconscious things becomes conscious. They don't show you exactly how quantity, at some point, becomes a qualitative experience. Neither do they speak of who is being informed of the process if the process itself is intrinsically unconscious in their view. The solution to the hard problem is very simple. Consciousness is the very ground of existence, and therefore it grounds and supports information. It's the ground because nothingness, as an abstraction, cannot exist by definition. In order for information to be said to exist, it needs to inform a witness. Information comes into existence when it's perceived. The transpersonal near-death experience of Nancy Rhines certainly supports the notion that we become privy to more information, including past lives. This is a woman who started out from Catholicism and eventually matured into science, reason, and de facto atheism. I highly recommend that you watch her story on the Coming Home channel, and as you watch it, you will immediately detect pointers to monistic idealism. If you are versed in Bernardo Kastrup's analytic version, you will recognize the unity that goes beyond empathy regarding other people, and the hospitable light that refers to itself in the singular and plural. There is also the realization that our ultimate home is a state of love and peace, and that this life is an illusion derived from a larger reality, transcending the time and space of this physical universe. Nancy Rhines is the first person I've heard referring to this earthly life as the near-life experience. Besides reinforcing to an extent analytic idealism, this NDE, like many others, also hints at blissful intermediate or in-between states, which some people might be inclined to regard them as spiritual buffer zones or holding places, or even the Bardo state mentioned in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, where more learning about mental experiences can take place before moving on to other realms or arriving at our home, the one consciousness. The trouble with naysayers of idealism is that they subscribe to a form of so-called realism, whereby objective reality is something that exists independent of mind, but indirectly apprehended by it, leading them to a premature materialist conclusion. They view idealists as having a kind of unscientific, romanticized view of the world, departing from verificationism and invoking the supernatural. This is why Kastrup has stressed that he is a naturalist. If the world is mental in nature, it's because that's just the way reality is, and what is unsupported, or certainly not verified, is this physicalist notion that most of our universe is not mental. It's no wonder that most people who start with analytic idealism, or even Hoffman's conscious realism, and sincerely try to comprehend it, conclude that it is actually a more parsimonious realism, as it doesn't violate Occam's razor, and it is consistent with empirical observations. Idealism is experiential realism. All we have is mentation, nothing else. Idealism is also epistemologically consistent because it doesn't claim anything beyond the one thing we can absolutely be sure of. Our reality is an experience. We are unequivocally conscious right now. Without consciousness, there is no reality. Consciousness is the noumenon, and its contents are phenomenal. This is direct realism. Kastrup has a book called Science Ideated, The Fall of Matter and the Contours of the Next Mainstream Scientific Worldview. The book shows that we don't need new physics for idealism, and in fact science is clearly more congruent with it than physicalism. One could also write a book called Religion Ideated, or in the least one called The Bible Ideated, regarding certain parables that illustrate human psychology as it relates to the collective unconscious, Jung's mind at large, for instance. In the story of Job, God appears to be ignorant of his predicament and reasons for questioning his misery. Because Job is also an expression of the mind at large, God is everywhere, as they say, and therefore it is awake in human form. He reminds Job that the world precedes him as well as all creatures, that it was set in motion before all life on earth began. But Job also shows the mind at large another more constricted and focused perspective full of meaning. Job is God awake as a human being. The story of Christ follows the story of Job as a representation of how to best conduct oneself as a human, by being strong, brave, holding the line, and being compassionate, understanding and forgiving. Through Christ, the mind at large also realizes an ideal that everyone can aspire to. Sir Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff are coming very close to realizing the primacy of consciousness. Penrose dithers between two notions, that either the collapse of the wave function causes consciousness, or that perhaps it is consciousness. In any case, consciousness precedes life on Earth and isn't a product of evolution at all. Moreover, they consider that one of the primordial flavors of consciousness, so to speak, is pleasurable and could be the main driver in evolution, explaining why life forms avoid pain and discomfort, seeking safety, equanimity, peace, pleasure, and overall happiness. As Jung once said, nothing is possible without love, for love puts one in a mood to risk everything. It's not that the collapse of the wave function causes consciousness. They need to go beyond it, but at least they are closer to idealism than the physicalists who absurdly posit that the magic happens at the level of neurons. The collapse of the wave function is what consciousness is doing. The doer doesn't require explanation because it is the ontological primitive. It is fundamental as the only logical basis for reality. It is a dimensionless something capable of begetting multiple dimensions. These great minds have detected certain subatomical structures found in molecules such as serotonin and DMT, which are targeted by anesthesia, which we know to suppress qualia states. Further experiments here can be conducted whose results are predicted to further subvert the notion that life precedes consciousness. They may even find that the pleasure principle in consciousness explains self-preservation and pleasure-seeking on a classical level. Penrose's research reminds me of another quote by the comedian Bill Hicks. Quote, "Today, a young man on acid realized that all matter is merely energy condensed to a slow vibration, that we are all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. There is no such thing as death, life is only a dream, and we are the imagination of ourselves." Even Jim Carrey realized it when he said that he is not a man experiencing the universe, but rather the universe experiencing a man. We, as the primordial consciousness, adopted a limited perspective in this mental construct of a world, imprisoning ourselves with human logic, even when, upon examination of the roots of reality, we find that it defies it against our intuitions. This universe is unfolding, it's flowering, it's evolving, it's constantly changing. That's nature in a nutshell. The universe is doing its thing whether we fully understand it as human beings or not. We are beholden to it, we transiently represent it in human form, and ultimately we are the one canvas in which the colourful cosmic painting unfolds. Our bodies, like everything else in this solar system of ours, are made of stardust. The universe is a grand symphony of vibrations, and we are part of the music. One big wave function since the Big Bang. One cosmic idea amidst an infinitude of ideas in all likelihood. Hence metaphysical idealism. Here's another quote from Einstein which pertains to this. Quote, "A human being is a part of the whole called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion, to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty." Unquote. And to complement this, here's another by Carl Jung. "In every adult there lurks a child, an eternal child, something that is always becoming, is never completed, and calls for unceasing care, attention, and education. That is the part of the personality which wants to develop and become whole." Unquote. In the spirit of ideating scripture, I am often tempted to come up with a Jungian interpretation of biblical parables, or in the least to contemplate the psychological symbolism. In the story of Adam and Eve, Adam stands for humanity as a concept in mind, in the probabilistic framework of uncertainty, which could be represented by Lilith, before it became manifest as living, and life is what Eve symbolizes. The tree of life, which bears the apple that Eve is tempted to eat, is also known as the tree of knowledge. The serpent could represent the challenges of the world which tempt humanity to know more about reality in order to survive and improve the quality of living. The temptation to become omniscient like God or the universal mind. And the snake also sheds its skin, promising change and development. It can also symbolize egocentrism and self-preservation. The tree of knowledge symbolizes the dissociation which makes the perspective of duality, which arises from oneness, salient or reified. Once we go down that route, which is life's journey, we compartmentalize everything. We create divisions and distinctions with our personal minds. We conceptualize dichotomies within spectra. We simplify the shades of grey, as it were, into the notion of black and white. I also see how Christ represents the archetype of the Saviour, the Redeemer, the hero who saves the world with his own life and is immortalized in people's memories as he is someone who we can't help but venerate because we aspire to become that ideal in this life. Resurrection here is almost synonymous with remembrance. We remember our heroes. Christ teaches us to not give up in the face of adversity, to fight for what we believe in instead of giving up and playing the victim card. The hero archetype makes for good movies because it has so much impact on our psyches. Protagonists in films like Boss Level, The Matrix and The Edge of Tomorrow are usually Christ-like. In the latter, the hero who faces adversity and harsh judgment from the start is literally told that facing mortal danger, his proverbial dragon, is his chance of redemption. We also see that in the Matrix somewhat. You know, the hero also dies several times in order to save humankind. His dying is a result of mistakes he makes from which he is able to learn, making good use of another archetype, the fool or jester. We see the same thing in the film Boss Level, where the hero dies multiple times and is even compared to Osiris. Both heroes start with the fool, which, through trial and error, undergo tremendous improvement. They learn from their mistakes and strive towards order and justice. The chaotic forces of evil, on the other hand, try to make you forget the past or change it directly, sometimes peddling the specious narrative that they are good because they seek to change what once went wrong. The problem with this is that if the past is altered or mistakes are erased from memory, there is no progress and humanity will not learn. It's the antithesis of what the hero and saviour does. The villain wants to reap all the rewards without any effort. It is like Cain and Abel, where the former complains and curses God, while the latter does everything to follow the ideal. We see the same narrative and archetypes in the Matrix, where Neo also dies or sacrifices himself to save Zion and is resurrected. We also see his fighting spirit in other characters who believe in him and the cause. And what do those soulless machines try to do? To deceive, to manipulate, to obfuscate, and to erase the truth from memory. Neo, too, started out from the fool position, from absolute ignorance, as he was born in the fake world of the Matrix. He was ignorant about reality and its dangers. It took Morpheus, the god of dreams, to show him the truth about the illusion. Morpheus also stands for lucidity, awakening, enlightenment. Neo's anima is clearly Trinity. The name is quite telling, and she has his back at the end. There is a scene in the Matrix Resurrections which I found to be quite profound. A victorious Neo and Trinity embrace at the top of a skyscraper after fighting a horde of agents. We see a sunrise and rainbows accompanied by emotional music. They clearly complete each other like yin and yang, and the scene reminds me of the rising dawn, which follows the dark night of the soul. Which Carl Jung and his psychoanalytic colleagues, such as Marie-Louise von Franz, talked about, which has been described since time immemorial. The scene almost brought me to tears. Why do these films work? Because they appeal to those archetypes from the collective unconscious, because they are insightful, because we can't help but worship the moral of the stories and that transcendence. According to Jung, it is possible for someone to be overwhelmed by the collective unconscious and suffer a kind of psychosis as a result. This is said to have happened to the theologian Thomas Aquinas, whose ineffable mystical experience left him speechless for some time, and once free from his stuporous trance, remarked, "I can write no more. All that I have written seems like straw." His locus of consciousness, it seems, was overwhelmed by a glimpse of the mind at large that makes up our ostensibly objective world and beyond. The roots of our reality, essentially the quantum level, appear fuzzy because what we are seeing is a symbolic representation of that omnipotent realm, wholesome with infinite potential for finite expressions. From our bounded human perspective, all we see is symbolic representations of an underlying reality. We see symbols as well-defined objects at the classical level of reality, and because our minds tend to objectify everything perceived, we also see a representation of the quantum, which defies our human logic with superpositions, entanglement, uncertainty, and wave-particle dualities. The macrocosm is one type of decoherence of the subatomic world. Beyond the microcosm is a creative force which has most likely given origin to other worlds, some of which we would probably struggle to imagine with our currently limited human minds. Finally, I leave you here with an excerpt from the Corpus Hermeticum. Quote, "Eternity is an image of God. The cosmos is an image of eternity. The sun, an image of the cosmos. Man, an image of the sun." Unquote. And I'll leave you to decide whether or not the following is a good example of synchronicity. Stephen Hawking was born exactly on the 300th anniversary of the death of Galileo Galilei. Stephen Hawking and Einstein both died at the age of 76, and Stephen Hawking died on the date of the birth of Einstein, March the 14th. March the 14th also happens to be Pi Day. Thank you very much for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel.